Hey, welcome back to part 4 of the Spring Data Redis tutorial. In part 3, we started the test-driven development cycle to flesh out the to-do backend API. In this episode, we're going to take the server side of this project to a usable state, so we can later add a React MVC front end on parts 5 and beyond.
With me, Brian Sambo.
I need the corner.
Okay, so the next feature we're going to implement is the deleting all to-dos. And this would happen when the API user issues a post with nobody against the root or API, the /todos. So let's first take a look at what a test to start the TDD cycle will look like. So I'm going to switch to the code editor, and now at the bottom of our to-dos API tests, the Java, I've created a new test called test delete all to-dos. And the test, it's fairly simple. We're using the MVC mock object to perform a call to the delete all to-dos. And the expectation is that the status would be okay. So we are setting that expectation, recording that behavior on our controller. And then we're going to verify that the to-do repository is invoked at least once with the delete all method. So again, remember this expectation-based testing, and we're trying to ensure that we test our code and not the framework code. So without further ado, let's actually switch to the terminal, and we will once again run our Maven tests. So let's run our Maven test, and we should be back on the red stage of the TDD cycle. With one failure for the newest addition to our test suite. All right, so as expected, we have now 5 test runs, or 5 tests in our run, and we have 1 failure. So next, let's take a look at what an implementation for our delete functionality would look like. And notice that at the bottom of our to-dos controller, I've added a new method called delete all. It's using the delete mapping annotation from Spring. And it's a simple pass-through to the repository delete all. So again, here is the expectation testing that we were doing by saying that we were expecting the repository to be invoked at least once with the method delete all. Now that we have the implementation in place, let's go back to the terminal, and we will run our test one more time to close the cycle of the test-driven development implementation. Great, so now we have 5 tests, and they're all passing. As we've done before, let's switch to Safari and double check that our delete implementation now passes the to-do MVC, to-do backend set of tests. So I'm going to refresh that and notice that now we have a couple more tests actually went green, actually more than a couple, 4. The API root responds to a successful delete. After a delete, the API root responds to a GET with a JSON representation of an empty array. And perfect. All right. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so the next feature we're going to implement is how to retrieve an individual to-do by its ID. So let's go to our JUnit test, and let's pull in the implementation of the test to get a to-do. And as you can see, we have a new test method named test get a to-do. At the beginning of the method, I am using the builder API provided by Lombok to create a new to-do with a specific ID, 3936 in this case, and with the title, drink a cup of tea. Then in our expectations recording, we are expecting the to-do repository find by ID to be invoked with that specific ID, and we will return an optional of to-do. The optional, it's an interface that allows you to return a value or null. So it's a better way to handle null values in Java. Then we are going to use the mock MVC object to perform a get against our API by formatting a URL string that contains the root of the API to-dos, and we're going to insert the ID on a slash after the to-dos. Then we're going to expect that that returns a OK200, and we're also going to inspect the payload return and make sure that the title is the title of the object that we submitted in the first place. All right, so now let's switch to the terminal. And once again, we will run our tests. And we expect to end up with 6 tests and only 1 failure. Okay, so now we can see that we indeed have 6 runs and 1 failure, and we have arrived at the red stage of our TDD cycle. So now let's switch back to the implementation, back to the code editor. In the to-dos controller, now we're going to add an implementation of the get method. So notice that we have a new method, aptly named get, annotated with the get mapping annotation. We have in curly brackets in our URL string a path variable named ID. Then in the method signature, we have the path variable annotation to extract that ID into our long ID method parameter. Then we're going to use that ID to invoke the repositories find by ID, and then we invoked get after that. Remember that find by ID returns an optional. Get retrieves the object out of that optional. One of the things that I'm not doing in here, it's handling the case where there's going to be a null object in that get. So that will be probably something that we'll tackle in a later refactoring. All right, so now with the implementation loaded, let's go back to the terminal and run our test one more time. All right, so now we're back to green. Perfect. As we've done before, we should probably double check our implementation by using Postman. Before we do that, let's go to the Redis CLI and let's list the keys that we have right now so we can grab one of the new IDs and use it with Postman. So I'm going to grab this ID, and now we're going to switch to Postman. And in Postman, we are going to bring in the get to do request that I previously created. And I'm just going to replace the ID that I had in there before. Let's save it and execute it. And I notice that now the result, it's a properly formatted JSON document for one of our to-dos by that specific ID. Perfect. Also, let's go to the test suite in Safari for the to-do backend specs and refresh that to see where we are now. So notice that the spec tests are still not passing for each new to-do has a URL. So the URL field right now, it's null. So we have to handle the requirement that that URL field returns a self-reference to the object, to the actual to-do. So we will be tackling that on the next section. Okay, so now we're going to tackle the requirement that our to-dos contain a URL with a self-reference to get that to-do itself. And this is a light form of HATEOAS. And HATEOAS stands for Hypertext as the Engine of Application State. And it means that hypertext should be used to find your way through the API. The same way that you have a web page with hrefs to take you to different parts of a website, you will basically have hrefs or links in your API responses so you can use a prior response to know where to go next. In this case, the creators of the to-do backend spec did a very light version of that by just adding a URL field to a to-do object. So let's switch now to the code editor. We're going to load a test to check that we are adding a self-referential URL to our to-dos payload, or to our to-dos on creation. So noticing here that in my new test named test create to-dos contain a URL, first I'm creating a to-do with a given ID and the title find your code. On my expectations recording, I am saying that when you invoke the to-do repository with any, the to-do repository save method with any to-do, I will return the to-do that we created previously. On my actual test, first, as an action, I perform a post to the to-dos with the JSON payload. Notice that we're setting the application JSON content type, and we are sending the title, grab your hat. Then our character encoding, it's UTF-8, and we're going to expect that the return value is going to be an HTTP created, which I believe it's a code 201. And we are going to then inspect the URL value of our JSON payload and make sure that it has that self-referential URL to get the to-do. And in this case would be HTTP localhost to-dos / the ID of the to-do. All right, so let's now switch to our test as we've done previously, and verify that we are on the red stage of our TDD cycle. And indeed we are. As we can see on screen, we now have 7 tests running, and we have only 1 failure for the newly added test. So let us switch back to our code editor. And let's go to the to-dos controller. And now let's load the implementation for our URL self-referential creation. And notice that we have modified the create method. And now, when somebody calls create passing a to-do, we're going to first save that to-do so it gets its ID assigned. We need the ID to create the self-referential URL. Therefore, we have to save it first. So Spring-Data-Redis will add an ID for us. Then we create the URL by using the link to method. The link to method comes out of the HATEOAS APIs that we added during our Spring Boot project configuration. And we're also using the method on for that specific class. So method on will basically say, get me a method against this specific class, which is a controller. And I want that method to be the get method. And I want that get method to use the ID of the saved to-do object. And then with this self-reference, this allows us to create a link that basically points back to itself. And then we're going to get the formal href out of that. So that URL now would be added to, we're going to set it upon the object by calling the setURL setter method from our to-do object. And then we have to save our object again now that we have the URL set. So unfortunately, in this case, we have to do a two-step dance to save the object to Redis. We have to get it first to get an ID. We have to use that ID to create the URL. And we have to then set the URL back on the object and save it. But that's a small price to pay. So now let's go back to our terminal. And as we've done previously, let's close our TDD cycle by running the tests one more time. Perfect. Now we have 7 test runs and no failures. All right, and let's not forget where we are with the to-dos backend test suite. So let's switch back to Safari and let's refresh to see where we are. So as you can see now, we are passing the tests for each new to-do has a URL, and each new to-do has a URL which returns a to-do. Also, we have the can navigate from a list of to-dos to an individual to-do via URLs. Okay, so now we're going to handling the case where we need to update a to-do by ID. Let's bring in a test that would allow us to test updating a to-do. So on screen now we have a new test named test update a to-do. As we've done before, we're creating a test to-do with a specific ID. In the title, read a book. Now we have 2 expectation recordings in here. We're expecting when the repository is call using the find by ID method, passing the ID of the to-do we just created, we will return that to-do. And we're expecting that when the repository is invoked with the save method, passing any to-do class, we will also return that to-do. Then our test is actually fairly simple. We are invoking the patch method and passing a string pointing to that specific to-do by ID. And then we're passing the fields that we want to change as the payload of our patch invocation. Notice that we're passing the title find my code, we're passing completed as true, and we're passing that order field with a value of 1. Notice that when you do that on the content, we're calling get bytes to basically pass that as a chunk of bytes. And we're setting the encoding to UTF-8. And on the expectation side of things, we're going to expect a 200 back, and that the payload return contains the values as we have changed them. All right, so now let's switch back to our terminal. And as we've done many times throughout this tutorial, let's run our tests again to set the stage at the red stage of our TDD cycle. And as you can see now, we have 8 tests executing and 1 failure. Let's switch back to our code editor. And let's go to the to-dos controller. And we will bring in an implementation of updating a to-do. And it's actually fairly short, mostly because we have enhanced our to-do object to help us here. But let me talk a little bit about the update method that's been added to satisfy this feature. So first of all, we're using the patch mapping annotation, again from the Spring framework. And the request body, its annotation is being used to annotate the value coming in. So when we received a JSON payload request body, it's smart enough to take that JSON payload and serialize that into a to-do object, which inside of our method will be update. Now, what we're doing in here is finding the object by ID using the repository find by ID method. We extract the object, and then we're calling the update with the updated payload. Now, the update with method, it's a very simple method that I've added on the to-do object. And let's go take a look at that quickly. So the to-do object update with method basically takes another to-do object and it checks which fields are not null, and then it applies the values of those fields to the current object. So fairly simple. And then the final step of our update method is to actually save the object. So the repository class doesn't have an update. We just basically have just a save. And now we can switch to our terminal and finish our TDD cycle by running the test again. Okay, so now we have 8 tests and no failures. Also, let's check our Safari tests to see how we're doing against the to-do backend specifications. So simply, I'm going to refresh the page, and now we have all the updates, patch-related specs passing. Excellent. Okay, so now let's move on to finishing the last feature to satisfy the to-do backend specs. And that is to delete a to-do by ID. All right, so as we have done before, we'll start with the test. And now on screen, I've added a test to check for the deletion feature of a to-do. So notice in here that I am calling the perform operation from the mock MVC, invoking the delete method, passing a to-do with ID of 1967, and expecting an OK back. Typically on a RESTful API, when you delete something successfully, you just get a 200 back. And then I'm going to verify that the to-do repository is invoked with the delete by ID method, passing that 1967 ID. So pretty simple test. Now let's switch to our terminal. And once again, for the last time on our API implementation, we are going to run the Maven test suite, and we are expecting a failure that we will then implement a method to pass. All right, so now we have 9 tests and 1 failure. So going back to our code editor, and let's take a look at our to-dos controller. And now let's pull in an implementation to delete a given to-do by ID. And again, this is one of those pass-through methods. We basically grab the ID from the path variable put it into our long ID, and then use that to invoke the delete by ID method of our repository. Nice and easy. All right, so with that in place, once again, let's go back to iTerm, rerun our test, and voila, now we have 9 tests and they're all passing. We have closed that TDD cycle back to green. And let's not forget to check how our to-do backend specification is doing. So I'm going to refresh this, and what do you know? We have implemented the full to-dos backend specification. Excellent. And that, my friends, is the end of our journey. On the next episode, I will walk you through a test-driven development implementation of a React.js single-page application to go with our to-do backend implementation. Thank you so much for watching. Join me for part 5 of this series when we will cross into the world of client-side development and craft a React MVC app embedded in our Spring Boot application. And give us a like by smashing that like button. And subscribe for more Redis, Spring, and general Java content.